Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us, which is likely to probably be the most up to the minute, scorch your hair kind of panel. Let's see what the world says after we're done talking. Panel that's going to be at Netroots today. I'm really thrilled to be moderating a panel that is going to be featuring three extraordinary secretaries of state. It's a conversation that you rarely get to have, and I think it's fantastic that given all of the wackiness that's happening, the state races, the presidential races, that these extraordinary secretaries agreed to be with us at Netroots today. So my name is Vince Warren. I'm the executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is a litigation and advocacy shop based in New York City. We're proud to be associated with Netroots Nation for many years. And today I wanted to lay out the problem for this particular panel. The panel's focus, as you know, is going to be on voter suppression, election integrity and security, and maybe even gerrymandering if we can get to it. And normally we would all know what those things mean because there's been a long history, but it's a different scenario now. So we all want fair, secure, timely elections, but we have three essential problems that are facing this upcoming presidential election. First, the global pandemic, of course, which none of us have ever seen, lived through, or certainly voted through before. Second, the emerging tactics of a White House that is moving to very broadly and very clearly suppress the vote. And third, the impact of both the White House strategy and the global pandemic on marginalized groups that include Black, Brown, Native, poor, those with differing abilities, etc. In the past, under different administrations, when the question of voter suppression came up, it could really be put squarely on how the state treated Black folks, where it drew those lines, how it lied, how it lost the ballots and that sort of thing, how they've been targeted and disenfranchised by the state and federal policy. But it's a bit more complicated now, and particularly in this moment, because this administration's tactic is bolder, it's broader, and at some level, it is extremely transparent. And that tactic is to suppress the vote overall by criminalizing mail-in and absentee voting, by weaponizing the United States Postal Service that would be delivering those ballots, and by dangling the specter of a delay in the elections due to a national emergency. Each of those things that I just laid out is a constitutional non-starter on its own. It's a dead winger. But when you add the effect on marginalized groups and voters, which will be compounded as it always is, becomes broader and virulent societal political expression of white supremacy. So I'm not sure that the stakes could be any higher for the ability of the country to determine its future with integrity and clarity this November. But I've got good news. We are joined by three people who will navigate all of these questions, all of these concerns in real time. They will be facing the high wire challenges that we're all facing, including breaking news about what the president is doing about the United States Postal Service. And we hope that this panel will be able to provide some information, I think, about what they've learned from the current presidential primary season, which some of which happened pre-COVID, some of it's happening post-COVID or during COVID, what that planning has been, what they're watching out for, what we can all expect to happen in November, even if the only thing that we can expect is the unexpected. Which I kind of think is going to be the case. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you three secretaries of state. Secretary Denise Merrill, who is the Secretary of State of Connecticut, Secretary Jena Griswold, who is the Secretary of State of Colorado, and Secretary Jocelyn Benson, who is the Secretary of State for Michigan. It's great to have you all here. I'm going to throw out a question that I told you that I was going to ask before all of the news broke, and I'm really interested, starting with you, Secretary Griswold. It would be great if you could just give us a sense of what were some of the challenges that you were facing pre-COVID. You had a primary that happened before a lot of the lockdowns started, and what are you thinking about now? What's emerged since then? I would like to ask Secretary Griswold that, and then Secretary Benson, if you could sort of chime in with your pieces, and then moving to Secretary Merrill, that just had both a state and presidential primary just, I think, a day or so ago. So breathless, but still with us. Secretary Griswold, give us some of your thoughts on those questions.
Sure. Well, we actually had our presidential primary on Super Tuesday, so about a week before the nation was really feeling the shutdowns and the fear of COVID-19. But we actually had our state primary on June 30th, so in the middle of the pandemic. And I will say Colorado's election model is a great model, and it enables us to be in a really good spot when it comes to voting during a pandemic. So we have online voter registration, same day voter registration, in-person early voting, and then we mail a ballot to every Coloradan. And even before the pandemic, that has enabled us to have the highest rate of registered eligible voters in the nation. And often we are the leader in election turnout. So we set turnout records. And I will say, you know, we did a lot of work for our statewide primary to make sure it was safe and secure. I issued a series of election rules to make sure that in-person voting is very important. And by the way, when we're talking about younger people, working class people, people of color, it's very important to have mail ballots and in-person voting. And I'll tell you, in our statewide primary on June 30th, during the pandemic, we set a voter turnout record. We absolutely did. And it's just proof of how well the Colorado election model works. And I want to share with you, Vincent, one of the reasons that I am so passionate about expanding vote by mail for all is that my mom's a nurse and she's been taking care of COVID patients. And I believe that it is my job as Secretary of State to try to save lives and our democracy. And it's 2020, and unlike the president, I am not willing to allow Americans to potentially die because they're forced into crowded polling centers. What this nation needs to do is expand vote by mail for all. And when we're talking about all communities having their voice heard, which I'm really excited to have that conversation, it's a great tool for that. And it can save lives. And unfortunately, the president, he attacks mail ballots, he attacks the post office, now he's attacking drop boxes. Anything you want to do to make sure that Americans don't have to risk their health to cast a ballot, the president and the postmaster general are attacking. And I think it's really important to highlight today that he admitted that he is suppressing voters. He point blank said that he is trying to defund the Postal Service to stop mail ballots. He wants to force Americans to risk their health to cast a ballot. It is so undemocratic. It is so un-American. And I think every single American, regardless of party, should be very concerned of where this nation is headed under this administration.
Thank you for that extraordinary work. You also got a big old +1 from a Coloradan in the chat that said it is so easy to vote for Colorado as a New Yorker. I'm a little jealous. Secretary Benson, thanks for joining us. And your thoughts on, particularly pre-COVID, because I think you also had primary pre-COVID, and what the post-COVID world looks like, and your thoughts about the shenanigans going on with the United States Postal Service.
Well, thanks for having me here today. It's great to be back. The last time I spoke at Netroots, I was actually with my current colleague. Then neither of us were Secretaries of State, Maggie Toulouse, who's the New Mexico Secretary of State. So it's great to come back now, about 10 years later, and share with you the perspective of overseeing elections in a critical swing state that is going to have an impact and has been under fire since I took office, if not before then, with regards to access to the vote. We've had 3 of our 4 elections this year. We had one in March, one in May, and one just last week on August 4th, and then of course November. And what that has enabled us to do is prepare and develop data to ensure what's going to work best for our voters in Michigan this November, and how to not just ensure that our system is accessible and truly accessible to every voter, but also that it's secure. And we've been grateful that we don't have to be pioneers in implementing things like vote by mail, which citizens voted overwhelmingly to implement in 2018, amending our state constitution to create a right to vote by mail. Already for 2020, we knew this was going to be a momentous cycle because my job was going to be implementing same day or election day registration, automatic voter registration, statewide post-election audit, and the right to vote by mail, as well as many other reforms, including an independent citizens redistricting commission, the membership of which is going to be announced next week. So with all of those changes, we were already prepared for an enormous amount of stress on our current infrastructure and need to educate voters about their new ways in which they could vote this year. That all then was exacerbated, of course, by the pandemic, which has changed so much for so many of us. But fortunately, we had already been on track to be prepared to ensure every citizen has a right to vote by mail in Michigan and develop our state as a model that can quickly turn from a state that had only reason absentee just 2 years ago to a state that is now a fully right to vote by mail state. And of course, the fact that it was citizens who overwhelmingly gave themselves this right that has enabled us to transition so smoothly and so quickly. But it's also the fact that through the amount of attention we've seen placed on vote by mail this year from all across the country in lots of different corners, citizens know about it more than they might have before. I also did a mailing to every citizen in our state, as did my Republican colleagues in many states that are in similarly situated positions, inviting people to vote by mail, educating them on how to do so with an application. That strangely became hyper-politicized. The president attacked me in a tweet, a number of tweets, some of which were inaccurate, of course, to sort of become par for the course. But you know, what we've saw in that incident and what we've seen in every incident thus far is that the truth is on our side. Voting by mail is safe, convenient, and secure, as demonstrated by the decades of which it's been all of those things in Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and in Michigan. It's a right that citizens want, as demonstrated by the fact that they themselves voted to give themselves that right in 2018. So adjusting to administering this process in a pandemic has been one in which we've been able to successfully do because of all of these factors, and frankly, the federal government's support through the CARES Act funding, which has enabled us to provide safe options for citizens to vote early, in person, or by mail. The last thing I'll say in terms of just the evolving uncertainties and attacks on vote by mail is that those of us who, you know, we've seen this storm coming since the pandemic hit in March. And so in Michigan, as in many others, we've been adamant, number one, about not postponing our elections. We've held every election on time and on schedule. Two, ensuring that citizens know about their right to vote by mail and how securely that is. We've done that successfully, as evidenced by the fact that we've got record numbers voting by mail in our state, more than ever before. And then finally, by being prepared for challenges with the Postal Service, by installing drop boxes all around our state, and we're continuing to do so in partnership with our local clerks so that citizens have multiple ways to return their ballots once they receive them. And again, nothing of this is recreating the wheel. It's by close partnerships with my colleagues in Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and others that have done this work for a number of years that we've been able to quickly import best practices and security provisions and be prepared for November. The last thing I'll say, and this is sort of our greatest challenge, and this is where we need a lot of people's help. I know we'll talk more about this. But the last thing is that we're doing all of this work in the midst of significant pushback at the national level, and likely from foreign adversaries as well. And so as we get closer to Election Day, the work is going to increase to educate our voters about the truth, about the accessibility of voting by mail, how safe and secure it is, the true opportunity they'll have in Michigan to vote in person, and then also everything we're doing to ensure that at the end of the day, our elections are an accurate reflection of the will of the people. We're on track to have record turnout in Michigan, just as we broke turnout records in our primary and in every election this year, as many states have done, as you've heard. But that said, what we're also prepared for, particularly in Michigan and in Arizona, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, is the efforts that may come after the election to try to delegitimize our results and impact citizens' perception about their accuracy. And that's where we need all of you to come in and ensure that the truth is told. about the accurate reflection of the results that will be out there, and ensure that citizens, regardless of how they vote, can have confidence that the results of our elections are an accurate reflection of the will of the people.
Thank you so much, Secretary Merrill. Extraordinary that you've managed to, through the voter referendum, switch from a system where you didn't have mail-in to now where you actually have absentee. Extraordinary, and it's very interesting to hear the various steps that you have to take to make that a reality. Sort of the backup that democratically based shift in the way people want to express and be able to vote. Before I turn to you, Secretary Merrill, I just want to acknowledge for two things. One is that Secretary Griswold, but for the pandemic, we would all be merrily romping around your state right now. So we're sorry that we can't be there in person. But the good news is that it basically took us all 15 minutes to get prepared to get on this panel, as opposed to having to drive many, many miles. So thank you for being in a state that was willing to host. Before I get to Secretary Merrill, I wanted to also just acknowledge what is bubbling up in the chat. Secretary Benson in Michigan, Secretary Griswold in Colorado, you have inspired tears of anger and rage from states that are not have not developed the level of progressive thinking around voting. So I just want to acknowledge that there will probably be some questions, maybe from Netroots Nation folks, about how you might help them move some of their secretaries of states, particularly places where the Republicans are in control, to do something different. But now I'm going to turn to Secretary Merrill, who has had the wondrous experience of doing both state and presidential about 45 seconds ago, and has lived to tell the tale. Secretary Merrill, thank you so much for being with us. What the heck was that experience like, and what can we learn from it?
Oh boy, let me take you to a very different place than we've just been visiting. East Coast, blue state, you'd think we'd be really good, right? We are tied for last in access to voting in Connecticut and Alabama. I think we are the only two states left that have no days of early voting, and you have to have an excuse to get an absentee ballot, very tightly controlled. In other ways, we made some progress. Yes, we have automatic voter registration, lots of work on voter registration. We have election day registration, but we have not been able to crack this. I've been trying for 10 years. And it is embedded in our state constitution, and Republicans have blocked my efforts to establish more voting by mail, days of early voting, whatever it was, for years now. And so here we are. And I will say that I was warned by my colleagues in Colorado and Washington and Oregon and other places that this is not easy to implement all of a sudden. So along came COVID. There was really no public experience with voting by mail or absentee balloting. Traditionally, we get about 4% of people that vote by absentee ballot, mostly because they're out of town that day. We don't even have the kinds of restrictions that other states have, like Tennessee, or Texas, where if you're over 65, you automatically get an absentee ballot. No, not in Connecticut. So we had to do this from scratch. I've been fought every inch of the way by Republicans who have sued me several times. We have won all the lawsuits. But the short version is, yes, we just had our primary 2 days ago on top of COVID, which was frankly the excuse we had for allowing people to vote by mail. It is wildly popular with the public. They are on our side. They want this opportunity. They're scared. They're feeling like they might get sick if they go to an in-person polling place. Connecticut right now is in a very good place with COVID. We're one of the lowest rates in the country. That could change, as we all know, but that ever-changing trajectory of COVID is also in real time changing people's attitudes about going to the polls. So we learned from other states lots of things, like we learned that we shouldn't be closing polling places, particularly in cities where there are big numbers of people that come out and could get sick while they're standing in line, a la Georgia, Milwaukee, other places. So we didn't do that. We made all our districts. Oh, and another thing, Connecticut is still, they don't call us the land of steady habits for nothing. We have no counties. So we do elections by 169, mostly very small towns with very part-time election officials. So the massive education project we embarked on was not just of the public to explain to them what was going on, but also to our local officials, many of whom were not at all in favor of this because they had never changed anything in years. So with all that, we managed. It was an enormous turnout of absentee ballot voters. People did take advantage of the fact we mailed applications to every eligible primary voter, and I was sued on that factor alone. They lost. So we then mailed absentee ballots to anyone who requested them. There were about 300,000 out of 1.2 million requests. And then struck a major storm about, what, a week ago now? And so knocked out power to about 800,000 people and most of the polling places. And connectivity was down. They couldn't process the ballots. And of course, the factor that the other X factor in all this was the Postal Service. So like elsewhere, we're very compromised in Postal Service. We were compromised before Trump started eliminating services by the post office. For example, in Fairfield County, Connecticut, your mail goes to New York and back again if you mail something across the street. So we always knew that would be a factor. We had a very short time frame. It became a bigger factor. People didn't get mail for 3 or 4 days. They had trees across their driveways. Everything was gone. So we had to extend, we decided to extend the time for voting. The real heroes in the thing were the ballot boxes, because of course people were already hearing the national news about the compromising of the Postal Service. And the statements by President Trump, he's been very, very overtly, transparently saying, yeah, I'm going to compromise the Postal Service or even eliminate it because I don't want all this voting by mail. So particularly the minority community really came to life with the drop boxes. We watched hundreds of people come by and drop their ballot in the ballot box. I was on CNN the other night. They did a special on this ballot box, and they watched as people came up and said, I'm not going to trust the Postal Service. I'm going to make sure my vote gets delivered. But I'll tell you, people are determined to vote this year. We've never had that kind of turnout in any kind of primary in Connecticut for many, many years. So that's the good news. People are fired up. They're going to vote. Now it's up to us to try to manage this incredible situation. And in a state like Connecticut, where we haven't done it before, it's a real challenge. I wouldn't kid you. I mean, my colleagues were right. It is very difficult to implement on the fly. I think we can do it, but it's going to require a big effort and probably more resources. Thank God we had the CARES funds to be able to do this, because we were able to provide resources to the towns in order to hire more help. We did all the mailing of the ballots for them. Without that money, we would not have been able to do this way. So I agree with my colleagues. Greatest challenge is the pushback we're going to get. Every step of the way, the Republicans have been harshly criticizing me right up through yesterday. First, it was the ballot boxes. They're insecure. They went to court to try to block them, just as is going on in Pennsylvania right now. Then they stopped on that. Now they're saying the mail house didn't deliver the ballots on time. It wasn't really the storm. It was Secretary Merrill and her mismanagement of the election, blah, blah, blah. So, so that pushback makes a difference, and it's hard. You spend all your time fighting off these challenges to your authority. Legislators get involved. So it's very, very difficult atmosphere. But I have to say, as you're hearing right here in 3 very different states, who is Secretary of State matters dramatically in these circumstances. We thought we had some sort of kindred souls in some of the states like Ohio, but now just in the last few days, I believe Frank LaRose, who's the Republican Secretary of State, has reversed himself on some things. I mean, it really matters, and I am so grateful that some of my colleagues who got elected in that last election in places like Arizona and Michigan and, Colorado, of course, because we gained back a lot of seats in that last election, and it's going to matter dramatically this year. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. And there's really, as I was preparing for this panel, I was beginning to look at all of the complexity and the layers, not even the political ones, just the legal ones. I know that, the legal issues and who is responsible for what and that sort of thing. And it's just a labyrinth of sort of layered protocols that have to be navigated. So I have tremendous respect for the work that you all do. I want to talk about, let's drill down on the post office situation, because I know that people, the Netroots Nation crew is filled with people that comment on these things, that are organizing folks, that are, when you're talking about voter education, now it's not even just education on who the candidates are, it's education on how the heck you get your vote in, and sort of what's the plan B if the plan A doesn't work out. But my observation is, maybe a few years ago, people were beginning to think, this postal service, I mean, if you were born after 1990, this postal service thing, I don't even know what that's about. I wasn't taught how to really write in school. Can't we just type it? Do we actually need that when we just have our phones? And what we're finding now is that things like the postal service, things like super old school stuff like drop boxes, become really, really key mechanisms to be able to ensure that votes get placed and that votes get counted. I wanted to, I'm going to ask a hard question, which is, what the heck do we do when the only way to get rid of an administration that is trying to dismantle the postal service so that it can stay in office is to vote that person out? At some level, it's this interesting, I think it's a catch-22. It's a catch-22, not a vicious cycle. You can't vote to get the person out of the office because the person who is in office that you're trying to get out will not let the postal service deliver your ballot, something along those lines. What is it that we do? What are you thinking about doing? What are some of the scenarios? How is it going to play out in a state where the courts say that we're going to count the ballot from the time that it was, from the date it was done, from the date that it was mailed, or the date it was postmarked, from the date it was received? What are your, starting with you, Secretary Griswold, what are you thinking about, and what is this going to mean for us?
Well, so talking first about being born before 1990, I do want to tell everybody I was born before 1990, and I am also the youngest Secretary of State in the nation. And you guys know throwback is popular. Stamps are throwback. Mail ballots are throwback. But what is really popular is voting by mail. But Vincent, you are exactly right. The administration is trying to create not a catch-22 for them, but a corruption of our democracy for them. They are literally, the president just said this morning, he is trying to stop vote by mail by defunding the post office. That is voter suppression, plain and simple. It does not come more straightforward than that. So I do think that we all have to fight, because you are right. They are trying to take away any access that the people have to change our future, whether it's closing down in-person voting. Okay, so let's do mail ballots. Then they lie about mail ballots. Let's make sure that any issue with the post office is solved. Nope, they're going to kill the post office. Okay, let's go to drop boxes to get around the post office situation. Then they litigate drop boxes. This is an administration trying to take the voice away from Americans. And it's hard. This fight is hard, but we cannot allow them to win. We can't. In Colorado, we are going to do everything that we can to stop the president. The Postmaster General is corrupt. It just came out last night that he has interests that are in direct conflict with the post office. Vice just broke that they are trying to slow down voting equipment that sorts ballots and sorts our letters. This is corruption. The president is using voter suppression. It is very clear. The quiet part that we all assume in the past of the history of voter suppression is being yelled loudly to us. And we need to make sure that every elected official, Democrat and Republican, knows that suppressing the voice of Americans is not going to be okay. So there's some things states can do right away. Nevada, they just passed mail ballot 2 weeks ago. It's the best way to vote during a pandemic. We can be adding drop boxes. Drop boxes are secure. They are accessible, and Coloradans use them. We've been a vote by mail state since 2014. And by the way, Vincent, more Republicans have used mail ballots in 2 out of the 3 last general elections. And just in our statewide primary, we had a higher percentage of Republicans use mail ballots than Democrats. So that's just to let everybody know that the strategy doesn't quite make sense. So I really think we are fighting for the soul of our nation, and we're not fighting for Democrats to win. We're fighting for voters to win. And I do want to share that when we adopted vote by mail, participation rates increased by 9%. Including 8% among Democrats, 8% among Republicans. But I do think it's really important to say, as a Secretary of State fighting for the right to vote, that voter suppression is systemic racism. And vote by mail for all is an option to increase access. We increased access and participation rates among Black voters by 13%. Latino voters by 10%, Asian voters by 11%, young voters by 16%. So we can have more access. We can have a healthy democracy, but that means fighting for vote by mail for all. We need everybody to lean in, write letters, demand your legislators do better if they're not, put pressure on your secretaries of state. If you need to follow what is going on in a straightforward way, follow me on Twitter. I am trying to push back on the lies that the president is saying because he has the biggest bully pulpit in the nation, and we have to push back against misinformation. And I will say, last thing, and then I'll get off my soapbox. I know it looks hard. I know it looks bad, but we are winning. We are winning. The president is doing everything he can to stop voting in November. But we've already won. In 2016, 23% of Americans use vote by mail. The Washington Post is saying that over 70% of Americans are going to have that access. That does not mean it will go without any issue in November. There will be bumps, but we have already increased access. Now we have to just keep on going.
Thank you for that. And we have actually many, many more minutes of soapbox time for all of you. Throwing it to Secretary Benson, I think a lot of people don't know that you are actually a voting rights expert. And just as props to you, I also note that I've heard that you clerked for Judge Damon Keith, who's a civil rights legend. So in the event that you're actually not going to be personally being able to file lawsuits against Donald Trump, what do you think the response is to the Postal Service attacks and the attacks that Secretary Griswold was also talking about, just about on every plan B that there is out there?
I think 2020 is just one big plan B in so many ways. And so we've been, again, anticipating and building contingencies since I took office, but certainly since the beginning of the year. And we've been, for example, I look at it as 3 acts. How does someone get their ballot? How do they return their ballot? And then how do we ensure that those ballots are counted? And everyone's going to answer that question differently. And to the extent that one path may become more challenging than the other, particularly with the uncertainties of the Postal Service, we provide other paths. So in Michigan, we're working, number one, to get everyone their ballots, however they choose to get them. In Michigan, you can pick them up in person from your local clerk 40 days prior to Election Day, or you can request to have them sent to you, or you can get them on Election Day itself at your local precinct. So we're educating proactively about how you get your ballot, and then how do you return your ballot. You can return your ballot in person at a local drop box that we've been working to install throughout our state since, again, the beginning of the year, or through the mail. And then you can ensure it's counted. There's a lot of voter education that we're doing around that to ensure people know to sign the outside of the envelope and all of that. I think, so, all of that notwithstanding, yes, it should come as no surprise that every effort to expand our democracy and protect access to the democracy is enveloped in a war and a battle among those who would seek to silence voices of our people. That is inherent as part of our country's history since its inception. And what gives me the most hope, and I'm actually very optimistic about this year, I believe we need to, of course, tell the truth about what's happening with regards to our Postal Service, but we also can't neglect the fact that, as Secretary Griswold said, we're winning. And we're winning because, yes, we've got some great secretaries of state around the country and great elected officials who are sounding the alarm. but we're winning because we're on the side of the people. Both sides, both parties. Members of both sides of the political spectrum have voted by mail in the past and have enjoyed doing so. The data points that out. But the other thing that gives me a lot of hope is that it's citizens demanding change that's actually created change. For, as I mentioned in Michigan, the reason we have vote by mail is because citizens demanded it. The reason vote by mail will succeed in our state is because citizens are becoming educated and informed voters and adjusting and as adapting as we are. The last thing I'll just emphasize, though, again, are the importance of partnerships. I'll often say democracy is a team sport. And so we've been building partnerships with business leaders, with employers, with universities, with sports teams to also make sure everyone has access to the new information they will need to know to adjust and adapt to the new realities of voting during the pandemic and in the 2020 election. So we're doing, again, everything we can to protect and preserve the access to the vote and the security of the process. But what we also have to be mindful of, and throughout this entire experience, we've been consistently looking ahead to what is the next move, what is the next battle. We all anticipated the move to cancel the elections and that rhetoric coming back in March. And we began planning for that, at least in Michigan, by making sure our elections were on time, on schedule, and demonstrating how you successfully manage and run an election in the midst of a pandemic. We anticipated the challenges with the Postal Service by preparing to implement drop boxes and educate voters to vote early and request and return their ballots early several months ago. But on top of all that, we're now anticipating what will happen after the election and the polls close, which will be an attempt to try to discredit the very processes that we're talking about protecting today. So we have to be prepared for that as well. And I'll just emphasize again, in successfully winning each of these battles requires all of us. You've got secretaries of state, you've got elected officials who are fighting these as well, but it's citizens and their engagement and your involvement and that will actually ensure the success of every single one of these efforts. And that's why gatherings like this are so important, so that we can all work together to ensure we're pushing forward together and with an eye towards ensuring truth and data and fair democracy wins the day.
Thank you for that. Secretary Merrill, in Connecticut, I was just looking at what some of the state Republicans were saying about you. They were really, really going hard. And as you said, and as Secretary Benson just said, that the idea of drop boxes can really be the sort of the pivotal hero in this current drama. My question really for you is, your comments on the Postal Service situation, particularly around the question of what is that? There are new processes that are underway for you. What's your biggest fear, your biggest concern with respect to postmark, and even the question of the capacity that you have to absorb in this new sets of forms of voting for you on such a massive scale, with so many people watching, and frankly, a lot of the right wing dropping lawsuits for everything from having drop boxes to not mailing out things quickly enough in a post office that doesn't work. It seems like you can't win. So what's keeping you up at night now that you've had a chance to sleep after the last primary?
Well, actually all the above, but I remain concerned about just having one way to vote. I think the best thing we're doing is providing options for people. And I just want to mention something we haven't talked about very much, but the minority community is very suspicious of mailing their vote in. They have a long history of voter suppression in those communities. And I think they prefer to come in person, just to know that everything is the way it should be. Traditionally, the problems we've had have been talking them into voting at all. Our biggest problem has been, that we can't convince people that it matters to vote. And now suddenly we're confronted with a whole new set of issues, but a community that has become determined to vote. So that's why I think I'm really uneasy about going to a total vote by mail system. I know that flies in the face of what a lot of my colleagues are doing, but I remain concerned that we have enough in-person voting polling places, particularly in cities. There is not a lot of experience in this state with mail voting. And so I think at least for November, we all ought to be conscious of the fact that we cannot be canceling polling places. That is the mainstay of many of the neighborhoods in cities, particularly cities with lots of Black and brown people. And they need to have that reassurance that their vote is actually being counted. I think that's also why the ballot boxes were so important, because I saw people, so many people, the elderly and minorities in particular, using those ballot boxes because they could touch it, they could feel it, they could watch it go in the box. It was right in front of town halls. And I think that reassurance is needed more than ever, because the victory that I believe that the Republicans have had, and not just the president here, is that they have managed to make Americans distrust their elections. That is probably the biggest fallout of this entire situation, added to, of course, the disinformation campaign still being mounted by many in Russia from all kinds of foreign and domestic bad actors. And I know some of us have started trying to track that, because that's going to ramp up as the election continues. We've already seen incursions into some of the campaigns, including the Biden campaign. So you've got a multitude of people trying to disrupt the election by making people distrust this very fundamental system that they have believed in very trustingly for 100 years. And now you have all these new fears. So for me, the most important thing is to make sure we have all these things available to people, whatever they choose to do. That's what the public wants. They want options. They want to make sure their vote is counted. And every time there are these lawsuits and these questions about, oh, are the ballot boxes safe or whatever, you're just taking one more little nick out of that trust. And that, to me, is the worst thing that's going on. So that's what we need to fight. We need to make sure that people understand that there are those of us trying to make it secure and safe to vote however you choose to vote.
If I could just weigh in there, I think I want to also underscore Secretary Merrill's point. When you look at the data in states like Georgia or Wisconsin, where polling places have been consolidated or closed, and you see long lines, particularly in urban areas on election day, it's in part for, there are decisions by election administrators, but it's also due to shortages of poll workers. And I think that's a really important thing for us all to recognize, because as we've launched a poll worker recruitment effort in Michigan that's recruited now close to 7,000 individuals. That enabled us to have successful in-person voting and embracing record turnout in our August primary last week. But I really, power to the polls, and many other efforts to recruit poll workers this year are one of the most important things that we all can be a part of and support to ensure exactly what Secretary Merrill says comes to pass, that we have full access to in-person voting for voters to take advantage of. So I would really hope every single person watching today signs up to be a poll worker in this fall's election. It's one of the most direct ways, in addition to voting, that you can ensure our democracy is protected and preserved.
I'll jump in there too. We're getting into the meat of the conversation, and there's a couple of things that I wanted to comment from Secretary Merrill. I think first off is if you have accessible elections, people will vote. That should be one of the major takeaways. But it's not just about our elections. The fact of it is that our government is full of people who do not represent everyday people. They represent themselves, corporate interests, and special interests. I grew up literally in a cabin with an outhouse outside. There was times when we were on food stamps. There were times when we were going to food banks. And I started working very young. I'm the first person in my family to go to college, first person to go to law school. And the fact of the matter is that elected officials are overwhelmingly not representing everyday people. And I believe that it's the trifecta of gerrymandering, voter suppression, and money in politics that enables a lot of elected officials to take office and not represent the people, because if they don't like the people in their district, they cut them out of their district, or they suppress their votes, or special interests will bankroll their campaigns. So I do think that we have a fundamental democracy problem. And part of the issue of getting voters to vote is having a system that elects people who will actually listen to the people and do their will, do things that help everyday people. I also think that it is imperative to keep in-person early voting and same-day voter registration, and of course, polls open on election day. That's what we do in Colorado. But I do think, you know, in our state primary, I ran a voter engagement push. We had 99.3% of all voters cast their ballot using a mail ballot. And the fact of it is that we had that in-person early access and same day in-person voting. So it's really important that people have all the options they need. And having that in-person access is really important. We saw less than 11,000 people go to the polls in our state primary, but over half of them were under the age of 34. So every voter deserves to have their voice heard. I think that we need a comprehensive voting system. And when I say we need vote by mail for all, that includes sending every voter a mail ballot and then enabling them to return it at a drop box by the mail with a functioning mail, but also allowing them to either return that ballot to an in-person polling center or even voting in person.
Thank you for that. Secretary Merrill, do you want to sort of jump back in? We really are in the meat of the discussion around what's at stake with the democracy. And just for folks that are following along and attending the panel, we'll probably kick to some of your questions in about 5 or 10 minutes or so. But Secretary Merrill, any thoughts that you want to add?
Yeah, you can see that those of us on the panel all agree that multiple options are the answer for a lot of this, because when one doesn't work so well or is, trumped, as they say, then you still have other options. And that was key in our primary, because when the ballots were delayed, people got them late, but the challenge was letting them know, don't worry, you can still bring it down to the ballot box. Now, I'm lucky. I have a Democratic governor who was very helpful, because every single day he gives COVID updates, and he included the information about the ballot boxes on these last few days. But for November, it's too late to change a lot of these laws in these other states. I mean, you're hearing here from 3 states, 2 of whom, have great laws. I think Colorado has one of the best, most options state in the country. There's a lot of others, and I don't know how we make it a national priority. That's another thing that, you've heard the Democrats talking about it. They haven't been able to get too far with it yet, but I think that's coming, and maybe that's what we need here. A lot of the secretaries of state would very much dispute the need for the federal government to step in, but in matters of civil rights, that's where they have stepped in the past, when there were clear voter suppression efforts in southern states and some others. So it's time, I think, but not in time for this election. And that's where we are. And that's how we have to keep pushing forward with this voting by mail, because with COVID, there are just lots and lots of people who are not going to risk their vote by going to an in-person polling place. And yet, the minority community is more worked up than I have ever seen them. And I think they are going to vote. One lady said to me, I'm going to vote if I have to crawl. And she said, if I have to risk my health, I'll do it. That's not what we want to do, though. We can't have people risking their health. And the minority community has already been decimated by COVID, much more so than the white community. And that's another factor. So with all that, all I can say is, people, you have to keep fighting. You have to keep sticking with us when we get attacked by this national Republican agenda, which is clearly what's going on, particularly the litigation. You're seeing the litigation in every state, and it's all the same. Right now, it's ballot boxes, particularly anybody in the audience from Pennsylvania. You ought to be very concerned about that, because Pennsylvania, they're trying to do the right thing, and they're being challenged in court as we speak. Stick with us. That's all I can say. And hopefully we can get this on the national agenda soon.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. And that's actually where I wanted to go next before we go to questions, maybe some brief thoughts and comments. It's rare that we have an opportunity to talk to progressive secretaries of state, and it's even rarer when we get to strategize with them. So I guess what thoughts would you have, particularly for two sets of folks? And I think Secretary Merrill, you just said this, in places where you have colleagues, and like Secretary Merrill, as you were saying, when you're in the fight of your life and you're getting hit from all sides and you can really use some advocates, what states are you seeing where folks from Netroots can really jump in and help push forward an agenda? Also, for those in non-progressive states and in red states, in problematic states and purple states with problems, what would you suggest that advocates be looking out for? Like, what's the thing that is going to be coming at them? What can be the strategy for them to push back against sort of the parade of horribles that that we've been dealing with in places like Connecticut that are only going to be compounded in other states? What advice did you have? Anybody can jump in and start.
Well, if you insist, I will start. I want to jump in there. Well, I think that we have to demand very clearly that Americans should have accessible elections, period, full stop. We also have to demand and underline what is happening. The president is willing for Americans to die to cast their ballots. Democrats need to lean in and say, we are the party of allowing every eligible person to cast their ballot. You know, here in Colorado, we have one of the most accessible election systems in the nation. And then last year, I ran a series of improvements. We added more polling centers. We added more drop boxes. For the first time ever, we guaranteed a drop box or polling center on every public university in all tribal lands. We worked with our tribes to make sure that the voter suppression we've seen against Native Americans never happens. We did parolee reenfranchisement, automatic voter registration, enabled 17-year-olds to cast a ballot in the primary if they'd be 18 by the general. Every state should be leaning in and adding access to voters. We have a corruption problem in this nation. It's no surprise that so many big corporations, so many of the uber wealthy have benefited off of the coronavirus while working people die. Enough is enough. And I think the Democrats really need to say what we stand for. We stand for civil rights. We stand against voter suppression. We stand against racial suppression. And we demand that the democracy is put in the hands of everyday people. And we have to say it loudly and keep on saying it in all of your states so that the nation is ready to pass H.R. 1. And if it doesn't pass H.R. 1, we need to pass major democracy reform in every single state in this nation.
Amen, Secretary. Secretary Benson, Secretary Merrill, thoughts on any thoughts to share, particularly with strategies that advocates are facing? Where's the rubber going to hit the road in some of the more conservative states? What have you seen as tools that advocates can use to either support secretaries of states that are trying to be progressive or to really push back against some of the evil evenness that is happening in more conservative states?
I can jump in here and just tell you what happened in my state. I could never have overridden the kinds of restrictions we had for this COVID without the work of advocacy groups. They were in every district, they were calling their legislators, both Republican and Democrat, and saying they demanded that their health was protected. This COVID situation has given new impetus to all this. And without that emergency, which it really is a public health emergency, we never would have been able to ramp up our efforts this way. So all I can say is, all those groups that got together after 2016 and said, we can't let this happen again. Well, we need you now. And organizing is still the best way to do something. And if you don't have a Secretary of State or a governor who will help, it's very difficult, but you've got to find somebody who's going to sound the alarm on people's health. That's, I think, the best hook we have to make this happen, because the public is with us. The surveys are like 82% of the public, both Republican and Democrat, want the option of not having to go in person to the polls. So, that's the only hook we have right now. And we're fighting a big battle. I mean, it's on every front. And so you just have to keep hammering away. But where are those groups? Come back to life. I just went to a rally the other day among minority women through the YWCA in our state, very actively registering voters, doing rallies, especially talking to minority women who are bearing a lot of the brunt of this COVID thing. They're the healthcare workers. They're the moms that are trying to find healthcare for their and childcare for their children, and they're being hit harder than others by the disease. So, those are the groups that you need to target to make sure they understand they need to get out and vote. And then if you get them motivated, they will vote, and we'll have to make sure that happens.
Secretary Benson, really thoughts of advice for advocates, particularly in states where there are just major challenges, even more major than in Michigan.
I think the important thing to note is that many people, we're in this era of great uncertainty, and many people are looking for certainty and clarity in how to vote and ensure their voices are heard and that their votes are counted. And so this is the year to, of course, do the voter registration and GOTV work that we've always done, but it's going to require more this year to ensure that every vote is counted and every voice is heard. And in particular, that means getting down in the weeds, talking about exactly what your options are in your particular state, making sure people know if they're voting by mail for the first time, all the options to return their ballot, if they use the mail to return it early, where their drop boxes are. The tutorials of how to vote are just as important as getting people to know the importance of voting and exercising their vote this year. And then, of course, as I've said, the other piece of this that we haven't really talked about is the era of disinformation that we're in, and the importance of doing this proactive voter education at a time when there are so many others with large platforms and megaphones seeking to hack voters' minds about the truth and reality and security of their vote and the accessibility of the process. So proactive voter education that is more granular and detailed and specific than ever before, using trusted voices and messengers to get that information out to communities, to voters who are in the most historically marginalized areas of your state or your community or your market. And then on top of that, be prepared to push back against an onslaught of deceptive acts and deceptive messaging that it will be flowing into the communities that are most likely to impact the outcome of the election. I think it's, the data certainly suggests that voters in cities like Milwaukee, Detroit, Flint, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, Columbus and Cleveland are ones that will significantly influence, if not determine, the outcome of the presidential election. And just as there are so many efforts to ensure that we're engaging voters in those areas, there will be just as many efforts to try to dissuade those citizens from voting and discourage them or sow seeds of doubt in their minds about the sanctity of their vote. So being prepared in all of those ways to be more creative than ever before and proactive at developing strong messaging. And I know so many of you out there are doing that because we're working with so many of you in Michigan and Detroit, and that's really great. But this is like an election year like no other. And so to continue to develop innovative ways to get that messaging to the citizens who need to hear it is going to be critical in the months ahead.
Thank you so much. Well, so we're going to move to some of your questions, and there are a whole bunch of them that are in the queue. And I think I'll start off with a combo, which is one is a question from Adam Mordecai about what is the percentage of ballots that are dropped off versus mailed usually in your states. If you have a sense of those statistics, that would be really useful. And then the other question that I wanted to connect with is, and I'm going to find it here in a second. I remember what it is. I don't remember who said it, but I'll jump in. It was a question about mail-in ballots and the effect of people of color. So Secretary Merrill, you were talking about how that particularly for people of color, the ballot boxes were really, really key. So the first question is mail-in versus drop-off. What do those look like? And then the second piece is there an effect for people of color with respect to mail-in specifically? And if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. In Connecticut, only about 4% of people generally use any form of absentee balloting or mail-in voting. And usually it's because they're out of town. They go down to the town clerk Applications are hard to come by. This is the first time we've ever done anything like mail applications. We can't just mail ballots because, of course, you have to have an excuse for voting by mail. So we had to mail applications to all the million people who were going to be eligible. That's the first time we've done that. So that was the first hurdle in a way, and yet it was a big piece of public information. So people, and that's most people, didn't even know what an absentee ballot was, probably. And so that was news to everybody. They were calling our offices. Some of them thought they were ballots, a lot of them. And, and people who generally, these are basically the party regulars. These are just Democrats and Republicans. We have a closed primary system in Connecticut. So if you can imagine the lack of information about absentee balloting in that group, imagine what's going to happen in November with the unaffiliated voters, which is the biggest group probably in most states. So that's when I say, that's what I mean. There's a big challenge just informing people. You add to that the fact you have a minority community that's very suspicious of any change in the way they vote. They're very they've been disenfranchised for a long time and don't see voting as an answer to much. I think after 2016, some of that changed. And there's a lot more interest in it, but they suddenly get this piece of paper in the mail and they're like, what is this all about? They don't even know if it's real. I mean, these are people that are not trusting of the system to begin with because it hasn't helped them that much in the past. So I think in general, they have told me personally, I live in a city that's mostly a minority, and I know many people have come to me and said, I don't trust my vote by mail. I'm going in person. Or that's why I think the drop box are such a wonderful thing. We never had them before. And so all of a sudden we bought them with our federal grant for every town. There were 2 towns that refused to put them up. They said they were going to be vandalized. There were all kinds of questions on the floor of the House because we had to get the legislature to vote to allow us to put up the ballot boxes. There was great resistance. In the end, everybody ended up complying because the public kicked in, because those advocacy groups just hassled those mayors who refused to put them up until they put them up and put them in a place where people could access them. So these are all fights, but it's taking a long time to convince particularly the minority and urban community that this is okay, because they're not so sure and they know polling places, but now they've got COVID. So you've got this push and pull, I think, in these communities. Public education by local groups, by people they trust in their community is the only answer, I think, because they're not going to trust institutions.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to kick it to Secretary Griswold, who does have to leave us after this comment to do Secretary of State duties and press conference. Thank you so much for being with us. And I would encourage people in the chat to throw some love, if inclined, to Secretary Griswold, so I can forward that after she takes off and slays the dragon. But what is your thought on the question at hand?
Yeah, so, 75% of Coloradans who vote a mail ballot return it by drop box, approximately, right? So we just had 99.3% of all voters use a mail ballot in our state primary, and it's anywhere between 70 and 80% actually return them to a drop box. And in our experience, we see that the use of mail ballots actually increase voting in communities that have been traditionally kept out of the process. So like I mentioned, we increased Black voter participation by 13%, Asian by 11%, Latino participation by 10%. And I do think it's really important, to Secretary Merrill's point, to really partner with community groups. We work with community groups that are going into prisons to make sure that as people come out on parole, they know they're registered to vote and that they have that franchise. We worked with many of the leaders of the protests to make sure that we try to shift, not shift, but complement the energy of protest with the energy of voting. So we actually organized a march to the polls. for our state primary, to march through historically Black neighborhoods, to really focus on getting out that vote. You know, I am going to be hiring an organizer to do outreach to the homeless community, because just because you lose your home and you're experiencing homelessness does not mean you give up your fundamental right. And I'll be going down in a couple of weeks to meet with the tribes in Colorado to make sure that we are supporting Native American access. So I do think it's really important to have trust with community groups, regularly meet with community groups, ask them what they need so that the state and elected officials can be a part of the solution, not part of the barrier.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. And thanks for spending the time with us, Secretary Griswold. And you got mad love on the chat. People are like,
oh.
Secretary. Yes, I've been following her since she was, you know, a child. So very inspiring. And thank you so much for your work.
Well,
and to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Vincent.
Absolutely. Just Secretary Benson, if you can, if you're able to, any thoughts on the particularly how people of color experience mail-in ballots versus drop boxes? Any thoughts on that you can share in terms of even how what the percentages are between the two, if you have them, but particularly by focusing on mailing in, are we unwittingly putting an additional burden on Black and brown communities from your perspective?
Well, again, this all gets back to voter education, as I've been talking about, and the importance of ensuring every citizen knows their options to cast their ballots this year. And we're not just, talking, when we're talking about, of course, historically marginalized communities, citizens with disabilities, citizens who speak English as a second language. There's so much work we need to do to proactively ensure that everyone has access to the vote. But what we haven't also mentioned is what we've actually found in Michigan to be the most determining impactful issue, which is felon disenfranchisement facing communities of color access to the vote. And by that, I mean, as you may know, and as others may know, I launched Voting Matters initiative, which is identified the top 100 precincts in Michigan with the lowest turnout. Interestingly or unsurprisingly, of those 100 precincts, 40 are where I live in the city of Detroit, 20 are in Flint. And as we've gone to those precincts and have conversations with people in the communities about what we can do better to ensure more people are participating in voting, the number one issue that has come up has not been questions about, well, it has been the question over whether someone has the ability to vote when they, regardless of their criminal history. And we know that that is an evolving issue and an issue that is evolving in the right direction. But it's so important to ensure that all communities know that returning citizens in Michigan have the right to vote instantly upon returning to society, that parole, probation, criminal history doesn't keep people from losing their right to vote. And so we found that proactive education, as I've said, from trusted voices in communities of color and throughout the state has been critical in ensuring that people have access to their voting rights and are engaged in the process. But on top of that, again, working with community leaders to communicate the opportunities to receive your ballot, to return your ballot, whether you do so through the mail, whether you return it through drop boxes, whether you vote in person on election day. The goal is to take democracy to the citizens, to meet people where they're at, and to deliver to them the system of voting that they want. And that's what we've been able to do in Michigan in partnership with the citizens who've amended their state constitution to expand voting rights and other things in our state. So the work that all of you and that I've done throughout my career in organizing in communities to ensure that people know their voting rights and have access to the vote, and then working with secretaries of state and clerks to make sure the process runs well, is critical. And I'm grateful for the great work that so many of you are doing in the city of Detroit and in Flint and Benton Harbor and other cities throughout our state to at this time of this enormous health crisis, this enormous economic crisis, and this crisis affecting our communities of color and the crisis of systemic racism, that we're all collaborating in ways to ensure our democracy becomes one and is one that serves as an avenue of empowerment where every vote can be counted and every voice can be heard.
Thank you so much. And I hope you guys can hear me. My computer just said my internet is unstable. At least it wasn't, my mental health. But so I apologize if I slow down and get elongated. But as long as you can hear me, here's the next question I want to throw out to you. It has to do with the Voting Rights Act. And the question from Shireen Mitchell is, how much has a gutted Voting Rights Act impacted your fight and your work on addressing these issues? Or put another way, what would you need from the Voting Rights Act moving forward in order to address some of the issues and the challenges that you talked about?
Well, the elimination of Section 5, and I don't think any element of Section 5 covered Connecticut. I don't think Denise or Secretary Merrill, and I know it didn't cover Colorado, but it did cover 2 townships in Michigan, and of course many other areas throughout the South. So the elimination of Section 5, which is, that what the gutting, the most significant gutting of the Voting Rights Act as occurred in the Shelby County case, is certainly is long overdue for Congress to recreate not just Section 5 and the pre-clearance requirements, but to do so in a way that is meaningful and has teeth, because even prior to the Shelby County case, that shield of Section 5, that shield of pre-clearance had so significantly been diminished and weakened over time. Section 2, importantly, still is in place and can still be used as the sword, as it always has been, to ensure that that private citizens are able to litigate challenges to voting laws that are discriminatory in purpose or in effect. But that said, those challenges have evolved over time, and a restored Voting Rights Act would include not only a strengthened Section 5 and a reinvigorated test and preclearance requirement, but also examining other things like felon disenfranchisement laws and looking at the data about with communities of color and voting by mail, and what further investment needs to happen proactively in communities where you see underrepresentation and historic low turnout, or historically marginalized communities with low turnout, so that we can be developing new solutions to proactively address that. Senator Harris's very comprehensive reform package has been really a model and she's really been the one who's worked most closely with secretaries of state in developing that package. And I think that serves as a great example of some of what we need to see and some of the reforms we need to see, in addition to the restoration of Section 5 in the Voting Rights Act, to really bring us forward to a democracy that's truly accessible to all.
Thank you so much. Just for those at home, my internet went out. I dialed back in, so I'm on the phone and on video because I can roll like that. Secretary Merrill, what are your thoughts, Voting Rights Act?
Well, I just wanted to weigh in on it because by now I've lived through the various permutations of what happened after they gutted the Voting Rights Act, and it will continue to be an enabler of different forms of state laws that will keep evolving, and they've changed. At first, it was photo IDs, and right after that, the Shelby County Act, that the several states immediately the next day changed their laws to require more stringent IDs. That fight has sort of waned, and then came the purging of lists. And we're still in the midst of that fight, which is, and still going on in my state, which is, well, the lists are bad, they're terrible, and therefore if you're mailing ballots to lists that have lots of dead people on them and people who are no longer at that address, then that's rife with corruption and fraud. So that's been the next wave of complaints, and the use of that act to permit states to pass very restrictive laws, the likes of which we haven't seen really since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So these are not settled questions, and we're seeing that now. And so it's going to continue. Right now, COVID has kind of upended everything in a different way, and we're having different kinds of fights, but the fight over the list purging is still going on. And I have no doubt that during this election, you may find out that your name has been removed from a list. We haven't heard about that much lately because the voting by mail has actually improved our lists, because we can tell when mail comes back undeliverable. So I'm using that as a reason to say, hey, this is a good thing that we're mailing ballots and applications for ballots to people, because we can now update our lists. And that has sort of stopped the argument for the moment. But that's the true implication of the Voting Rights Act gutting, is that states are now much more free to change laws to suppress votes in different and new and novel ways that I'm sure we're going to continue to see. So that is my concern. And we've already seen it going on in some places. It can be combated, but we need Congress to come back in and fix that right away. And I would second what my friend Jocelyn said about Senator Harris. She has met with us personally. She has tried very hard to develop a really comprehensive look at election law and possibilities for federal law on the topic of elections, which is a little bit tricky because states guard that right very closely. It has always been a state responsibility. But when it comes to the involvement of people's civil rights, they have stepped in and should in this instance.
Extraordinary. Well said. Tommy Yap asks a question. How do we change the GOP narratives around access programs like the villainous sounding ballot harvesting?
I mean, as we've said, the important thing of our work is that the truth and the data is on our side. That the reality is that voting by mail is safe and secure, as evidence of decades of success in many states, including Washington, Oregon, and Colorado. So I think, countering that misinformation with the facts and the truth, and really recognizing it and calling it out for what it is, which are efforts to sow seeds of doubt in the mind of our electorate about the sanctity of our elections, at a time when we need our citizens to rightfully so have faith in our democratic institutions now more than ever. Those sorts of things, whether it's taking to social media or using other platforms, are going to be critical. It's one of the reasons so many of us as secretaries have been partnering with our sports leaders and others with large platforms to ensure they're emphasizing and amplifying their voices as well, to push back against those efforts to misinform our citizens about the sanctity of their vote and the security of voting by mail in particular.
I find that particular narrative really, really tough because it got this great sounding phrase, ballot harvesting. When you think about what does it really mean, mostly for years, when you mail in an absentee ballot or vote by mail, you can have somebody else drop it in the box for you if you give them permission. And so they've made it sound like this is an evil, corrupt thing. I think we need a phrase. I don't know what it is, but we need a countervailing narrative that has some phrase to say, like, you're in charge of your ballot. I mean, what strikes me when I listen to folks that come from vote by mail states like Oregon and Washington have been doing a long time, it's almost like an open book test versus like the kind where you have to write on your hand what you're going to do. In our state, you're not allowed to bring anything into a polling place that is any kind of paraphernalia about elections. So I know people that literally write on their hand who they're going to vote for Board of Education so they can remember who it is after they look at it. In a vote by mail state, it's a much more kind of family process. You get your ballot and you can sit around the dining room table and talk to anybody you want about who you're going to vote for. What's wrong with that? It requires a whole new way of thinking about voting in many of our states. So I think that's the narrative we have to develop. This is your right to talk to whoever you want about and give permission to anybody you want to go deliver your ballot. That's the kind of narrative I think we need to develop to make this work.
Thank you for that. This is a question for Secretary Benson from Elisa McCool, coolest name ever. Unless it's Alessa McCool, which is even cooler. It says, hello, Secretary Benson. I'm from Berkeley, Michigan. I'm a Berkeley, Michigan native and fellow military spouse. Because we move so often, voting by mail is a standard practice for my military family and community. Is there a role for veterans and military family voices about how voting by mail is an important and established part of American elections?
Yes, and thank you for that question. There certainly is, and you may have seen a number of things we're doing in Michigan to engage our military spouse community and our veterans community as poll workers, as election workers, and as voices for voter education. But on top of that, that untold story of the reason why and the origins of voting by mail came through our military community is an important one to be able to share and spread, and your voice is one of those that is so important to be telling that story. And that said, we also need to do work. I know we're nearly out of time, and so we're limited in scope, but certainly the work to ensure our military service members and their families are able to return their ballots on time is just as important to think about this year, because we've got even more challenges with international mail. So thank you for your service. Thank your family for your service. And if you haven't already considered being a poll worker, I want to encourage you to go to michigan.gov/democracy-MVP and sign up to be a poll worker, because when we look at the successes we've had this year in Michigan with our elections, and I'm really proud of the record-breaking turnout and record number of people voting by mail in every community from both sides of the aisle. What's really made that all possible has been citizens demanding the right to vote by mail, serving as poll workers, the thousands of whom have signed up and served. And so it's particularly an opportunity for our veterans community and our military community to reflect that as well.
Thank you. And for our last question, Emily Crockett asks, what are your thoughts on the following about the recent polling showing Biden voters are much more likely to want to vote by mail than Trump voters? And how do we square that with the other data about how vote by mail increases voting in a bipartisan way? And how can we protect against further attacks that vote by mail is somehow partisan?
So I think we should build a democracy that's about how people vote and making sure voters can vote, regardless of how they cast their ballot. And so the data that we're focusing on is information about across the board, making sure every citizen knows the choices that they have to vote, has confidence that whether they vote early at their clerk's office, in person on election day, or at home, that their vote will count. Every state is going to be different in terms of the data of who is choosing to vote which way, and it's based on a lot of different factors, and there are a lot of voices that are trying to claim this, that, or the other with regards to the partisan impact. But in my view, building a strong democracy means setting partisan agendas aside and building the right system for every single citizen in every single community and every single voter. And so that's my focus, making sure everyone in our state receive an application to vote by mail, making sure every community has access to be able to vote in person without having to wait in line. And then voters themselves will choose what's best for them. And the part of over time, when you look at the metadata, you actually don't see much partisan impact on any of these changes. The only data source that I have found the only piece of data that I have found to be most that has not changed from election to election in our state has been the fact that young people overwhelmingly choose to register and vote in person on election day. 18 and 19-year-olds by far have been the vast majority of citizens registering to vote on election day. And many of you have been doing this work that I've worked with for a number of decades, know that as far as data is concerned, the most reliable data is around that, the impact of eliminating the barrier of voter registration, particularly for young voters. So, but still, even then, that's not partisan. That's just about an age group voting more than others. And we know it may have partisan implications, but those can change and evolve as well. So I'm just big on messaging that is about good government, democracy with a small d, and emphasizing access to the vote and choices for everyone, and then deferring to voters on how they choose to vote, making sure every system works for them. Secretary Merrill?
Yeah, I would concur with all of that. And also, I have not seen any data, and so I don't know what study anyone's referring to. I've seen no data or no evidence that it benefits one party or the other. I mean, I wish it were true, honestly, but it's not. In my state, of course, more Democrats use mail-in voting this time. Probably will show that with our primary than before, but that's probably because we have more Democrats than Republicans in Connecticut. Traditionally, the big majority of people who used absentee ballots were in Fairfield County. They're commuters to New York, and they're mostly Republican. And that's what our data shows. So I think Secretary Benson's right. I think every state would be a little bit different, depending more on their demographics and their age groups and that sort of thing than party. So I don't know how you counter that narrative, but it's true. Lots of people are trying to tell lots of different stories, and there's quite the cacophony at the moment. Hopefully we can sort through it and all come out in a place where we realize what we're trying to do, particularly as secretaries of state. We're in a very interesting position because we are elected partisanly, mostly, most of us, and yet we're expected to be nonpartisan. And I think there is a strong ethic among secretaries that is exactly what we are here for. We are here to represent all voters. We want to make it, our party happens to want to make it easier for people to vote. And there are people that would dispute that. They would say, well, why should we make it easy for people to vote? Shouldn't it be hard? Shouldn't it be, it's not just a right, it's a privilege. And, and I don't personally understand that way of thinking, but there is a narrative out there. This country is deeply divided on many issues. This is no exception. So I hope we can just push forward in this instance where we are in a very critical moment in this country and people do want to vote. That was our biggest challenge for years. And now it's the opposite. We're worried about, so many people overwhelming the system that we won't be able to get them their ballots in time. I keep remembering that that's not actually a terrible problem to have in the end. Lots of people are going to be voting and they want their voices heard. And that's the first time in a long time that I've seen that. So I think it's a great thing and we'll just have to manage it, all of us.
Wow, and look at that. We're at the dot of 3:30. I just want to say two quick things. Emily put in the chat, thanks for these answers. It is the moderator's privilege to be able to help facilitate answers to really, really good questions. So thank you for that. And for all of the people that listen, I also have to say this has been a tremendous privilege to be moderating this conversation with three extraordinary women who are leaders, who are brilliant, and who are inspiring in ways that I thought, gosh, on my list of people to be inspired by, secretaries of states, not so much. I am totally inspired. It's been a privilege to serve you and to lift up your voices and for you to educate us in the way that you have. And to Netroots Nation for pulling together this great panel, because it's very clear that the Secretary of States need the advocates and the advocates need the Secretaries of State. So thank you so much for all three of you for being on this panel. And thanks everybody for joining us.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Vincent.